Here's how the 16th century Suleiman Charitra begins. There was once a mighty lord of Ayodhya. In splendor and prowess he was like Indra, the king of the gods. Brave and devoted to public welfare, he was the famous king A.N.D, always kind and merciful, a bright jewel of the Lodi line. An extraordinary Sanskrit poem lush with erotic rasa imagery, the Suleiman Charitra translated the biblical story of Solomon into India's ancient language of kings and priests. But the Suleiman Charitra was by no means unique. It belonged to a world where Vijayanagara Sanskritists praised Chauhan allies of the Mandu Sultans, while English Jesuits wrote Konkani Puranas about Jesus. This uniquely Indian syncretism wasn't simply motivated by devotion, as we sometimes think. India's historical diversity developed from hard-nosed politics and astonishing inventiveness, which helped make it a global juggernaut unique for its time. Empires dominate our imaginations. Who doesn't like to see maps painted with their own colors? But the fact is that in South Asia, it's moments of imperial disintegration when regional identities and ideas assert themselves that give rise to the most brilliant cultural moments. Consider northern India in the 15th century CE. The power of the Delhi Sultanate had just been shattered by the Central Asian warlord Timur, who massacred the mostly Muslim populace of the city. From Gujarat to Bengal, Indian societies and religions were in churn as new communities obtained political power and sought legitimacy. And they had many avenues to do so. For example, a clan of militarized Gujarati peasants who had served in the retinue of Firuz Shah Tughlaq decided to convert to Islam, supposedly on the initiative of a Sufi saint. Some scattered sources also called them Rajputs and descendants of Ram. These guys declared Gujarat an independent sultanate, which they ruled from the capital, Ahmedabad. Other minor clans built forts atop hills and sought a position in the Sanskritic caste hierarchy. In the edited volume After Timur Left, Culture and Circulation in 15th Century North India, historian Aparna Kapadia studied Gangadhara, a poet from the South Indian Vijayanagara Empire, which we talked about here. Gangadhara worked for Gangadas Chauhan, a minor chieftain of Champaner. The poet had arrived there via Ahmedabad, where he claimed to have defeated rival Sanskrit poets at the Sultan's court. The Chauhans commissioned Gangadhara to integrate them into the world of Sanskrit court culture, which he did by romanticizing a conflict they had with the Gujarat Sultans. In his poem, the Gangadasa Pratapa Vilasanatakam, he explains how Gangadas Chauhan exhibited ancient Kshatriya values by refusing to give up political refugees to Sultan Muhammad of Gujarat. The Sultan besieges Champaner and kills these refugees despite Gangadasa's valiant resistance, but is unable to take the fort. Finally, the situation is resolved when the neighboring Sultan of Mandu attacks Gujarat. Now, the Sultan's Kshatriya vassals advise him in Sanskrit, and I quote, "The protection of one's own territories is the king's foremost task." And so the Sultan retreats and the Chauhans thank the gods for Mandu's intervention. What this story achieves quite deftly is connecting the Champaner Chauhans to ancient Sanskritic notions of royal behavior, while also justifying their balancing game with sultanates and acknowledging the sultanates as serious and legitimate overlords. Gangadhara's work also shows us that Sanskrit court poetry was alive and well in the Sultanate-dominated world of 15th century northern India. Little kings were still using Sanskrit to legitimize themselves, even as powerful rulers inclined to the political prestige of Sultanate systems. But sultans, it seems, were very well aware of Sanskrit, at the very least hosting and employing Sanskrit poets. In fact, the 15th century saw substantial Sanskrit engagement with Sultanate religion and language, despite the often repeated myth of relentless persecution. As distinguished translator A.N.D. Haksar writes in his introduction to the Suleiman Charitra, there was the Parasi Nama Malla, a Gujarati Sanskrit Persian lexicon, and the Katha Katuka, a Hebrew legend rendered into Sanskrit via Persian. The 15th century Purusha Pariksha Vidyapati, studied by historian Sunil Kumar in After Timur Left, even depicts Muhammad bin Tughlaq as an ideal sultan, using a story of young Kshatriyas vying for his favor to impart lessons on courtly behavior to new warrior clans. Parallel processes were at work in South Asian Persian and Arabic literature as well, as we talked about in this video. Now, what we're seeing isn't a devotional syncretism between a unitary Hinduism and a unitary Islam. This myth is much admired by liberal India and trashed by the right, but it doesn't really capture the uniqueness of what was happening in the 15th century. This babble of texts and ideas is because a hodgepodge of spiritual, military and literary entrepreneurs of many faiths, cultures and ethnicities were building alliances and finding a place on the ladder of South Asian politics. This led to an an astonishing intellectual open-mindedness at a time when Ming China was becoming increasingly closed off to the world and Europe was preparing for brutal, religiously justified expansion into the Americas. So India's developing syncretism, we have to say, was often contradictory and uneven. By the early 16th century, the Lodi dynasty had managed to establish some authority over the upper Gangetic belt. Now its official policy discriminated against Hindus, but its regional governors issued Sanskrit edicts in sites such as Bayana in Rajasthan. It was also under Lodi auspices that many Hindu holy orders settled in Vrindavan. And in Ayodhya, a dynasty of Lodi governors commissioned the Kshatriya poet Kalyana Malla to write the Suleiman Charitra, a Sanskrit Bible story about King David who lusted for his general's wife Bathsheba. Now, as Haksar writes, the Charitra is quite unashamedly suffused with Sanskrit literary ideas, particularly the Shringara Rasa, the romantic or even sexual essence. The beauty of the naked Bathsheba, rendered into Sanskrit as Saptasutta, is explicitly described as his seduction by and intercourse with David. This detail isn't present in the Bible, nor was it in the Arabic or Persian commentaries that Kalyana Malla must have read. All of these are his innovations intended to bring this biblical story into line with Sanskrit court culture. Malla describes his patron Lad Khan as an expert in the science of love, a skill regarded most highly by older Sanskrit literature such as the Kama Sutra. We know from other sources that Lad Khan was a generous, if a slightly feckless chap. He was possibly dyslexic and he tended to leave his officers to do the hard work while he enjoyed the cultural entertainments of the court. Now, there's no doubt this guy was well educated in Persian and Arabic literature, particularly related to the Quran, so it's quite telling that he commissioned a Sanskrit text bridging these worlds, not just a literal translation, but a cultural translation. Now, this impulse to bridge worlds, to harness them for patrons' interests, continued into the 16th century when North India's many regions were integrated into the Mughal Empire. The Mughal court commissioned multiple Persian translations of the Mahabharata and Ramayana, and generally, if unevenly, allowed religious freedom at a time when Europe was dissolving into sectarian conflict during the Protestant Reformation. Scholar and poet Ranjit Hoskote, for example, has discussed the work of Thomas Stevens, an English priest who settled in Goa and wrote the Krista Purana, an 11,000-verse history of the world from its creation to the death and resurrection of Jesus. Written in Konkani and Marathi, it was set to the meters of bhakti poetry. In doing so, Hoskote points out, Stevens was not only acting in contradiction to the Goan Inquisition, he also preceded the Vatican's 1960 edict that preaching should be sensitive to local cultures by some 400 years. He developed a vocabulary for Indian Christians that is still used today, such as the term Jnanasnana for baptism. Meanwhile, Stevens' contemporary Hieronymo Xavier was trying to convert Indian elites at the Mughal court, collaborating with the Indian scholar Maulana Abdus Sattar Lahori to produce a Persian biography of Jesus, the Mirat al-Quds. According to Hoskote, this is the first modern biography of Jesus ever written, drawing and interpreting a variety of texts and tailored to Indian Muslim tastes through effusive praise of the venerated Virgin Mary. Mughal court painters, many of them Hindu, decorated with illustrations inspired by the prints coming out of Europe at the time. Ironically, such a text could not have existed in contemporary Europe. In many ways, it was only India that possessed the political, environmental, and intellectual prowess to even imagine such a project. But the Mirat did not succeed in winning over Mughal converts despite the novelty of this project. The Mughals were pretty suspicious of the black and white worldview of the Jesuits, which was not suited to the diverse aristocracy they ruled over. Now, the point of all this isn't to eulogize the bonhomie of pre-modern elites, Hindu, Christian, Muslim, Persianate or Syncretic. What I want to argue is that syncretism and tolerance are not some kind of inbuilt feature of Indian civilization which we can take for granted, pay lip service to or chip away at for political profit. Despite many efforts at persecution and conversion, syncretism developed again and again in India through serious political and intellectual commitment. Invariably in Indian history, this has proved worth the effort because it allowed for the influx, development and spread of invigorating new ideas and possibilities, ideas uniquely Indian. I'm sure this might be a controversial opinion, so if you have questions or comments, we'd love to hear them. Follow us everywhere on social media. You can find me on Instagram at Anirudh and on Twitter at A.N.D. We'll see you next week in the new year.